In a moment no one inside the palace expected, not even those closest to the heart of royal tradition, Princess Anne, long regarded as the monarchy's most unmovable constant, made a decision that quietly altered the course of history by transferring her most sacred distinction to Catherine, a move that sent shockwaves through every corridor of royal life and ignited whispers that refused to stay contained, because this was not announced with ceremony or spectacle but unfolded in near silence and ordered the Queen's gallery cleared for a private exchange with no press, no witnesses beyond the essential few, and no tolerance for questions, a command that alone unsettled centuries of protocol, and when Catherine arrived through a discreet entrance accompanied by Anne's most trusted stewards, the meaning of the moment became impossible to ignore, because her presence was not symbolic, it was decisive, and as she stood composed and unwavering opposite Anne, it became clear this was not an honor lightly passed, but one historically preserved within the deepest core of royal continuity, an emblem that represented the very soul of the institution, now entrusted to a woman still officially outside the sovereign line yet unmistakably at its center, a decision made even more striking by the absence of Queen Camilla, whose non-appearance echoed louder than protest amid circulating claims of opposition, and when the Archbishop of Canterbury arrived unexpectedly, the gathering shifted from private to profound, signaling significance that extended beyond family into spiritual and constitutional weight, made even more resonant by the timing, exactly 1 year after the private remembrance of Queen Elizabeth II, a date and would never have chosen by chance, because to those who knew her devotion it was a declaration without words, a passing of trust shaped long before the world was meant to see it, forged through years of quiet alignment between two women bound not by blood but by duty, an alliance that began when Catherine first entered royal life under relentless scrutiny and found in, and not sentiment but recognition, someone who saw endurance beneath restraint and spoke words that later proved prophetic, urging her to withstand the storm because one day she would guide direction, a moment that marked not mentorship but preparation, leading them to revive an ancient ceremonial oath almost forgotten by time, one that allowed the guardian of tradition to pass responsibility not by lineage but by merit, an oath Catherine recited without hesitation, confirming she had not been reacting to events but ready for them, as Anne's growing concern over the monarchy's drifting clarity and fragile cohesion deepened, especially amid uncertainty surrounding leadership and public trust, and in Catherine she recognized a rare balance of respect for tradition and capacity for renewal, a figure capable of holding structure steady while allowing it to breathe, and, over time, subtle remarks, discreet meetings, and carefully timed reassignments of trusted aides quietly laid the groundwork for what would come, even as resistance formed elsewhere, because within Camilla's circle the transfer was seen not as evolution but threat, a disruption to influence built through ceremony and visibility, and as realizations spread that the decision had moved forward without reversal, frustration escalated into frantic attempts to regain control that fell apart as public momentum surged, especially after leaked remarks revealed deep resentment that only intensified public alignment with Catherine, and when palace communications proceeded under William's silent approval, global headlines reframed the moment not as inheritance but as emergence, while crowds gathered not in protest but affirmation, leaving tributes that spoke of trust and unity, elevating Catherine into a role defined not by law but by collective belief, a response so powerful it reshaped the narrative faster than any decree could, prompting broadcasters and commentators to adopt language never formally assigned yet instantly accepted, reinforcing a perception that authority had shifted in spirit if not statute, and when William issued his brief but resolute support, the direction became undeniable, drawing a line that clarified loyalty and future alike, and as anticipation grew for the king's response, Charles finally appeared not with command but reflection, acknowledging the moment as part of a living institution that adapts to endure, praising Anne's stewardship and Catherine's steady grace while carefully avoiding denial or correction, and notably omitting any mention of Camilla, an absence that spoke volumes and deepened speculation, especially as reports surfaced of intense behind-the-scenes efforts to intervene that ultimately failed, including appeals to obscure procedural clauses that were swiftly rejected on grounds of overreach, leaving credibility diminished and influence eroded, while revelations from within palace walls exposed attempts to undermine the legitimacy of the very traditions once upheld, actions that reached and quickly and closed any remaining door to reconciliation, culminating in the quiet withdrawal of symbolic protections that signaled a decisive shift. Yet the most extraordinary confirmation came from the past itself, uncovered within the royal archives, a sealed directive from Queen Elizabeth II outlining a vision for continuity grounded in discernment and public trust, naming Catherine as the figure to be empowered should internal harmony falter, accompanied by a personal letter affirming belief in her capacity to carry grace as responsibility, a message released with care and intention that stunned the nation and reframed the entire moment not as defiance but fulfillment, explaining why and had waited until the signs aligned, until public conviction was unmistakable and silence within leadership undeniable, and when the final ceremony took place in quiet grandeur, free of crowns or proclamations, the meaning resonated louder than formality ever could as and placed her own sash upon Catherine, symbolizing not authority seized but trust given, witnessed by a nation that felt not divided but steadied, and as William spoke words bridging generations and others stepped forward in unprompted unity, the anthem rose not for power but for protection, echoed by a single phrase spreading across hills and screens alike, affirming belief in what comes next. And as global voices acknowledged the echoes of that moment faded across the highlands, one final image lingered above all unlike anything seen before, a young princess observing not from above, by announcements or declarations, every detail, but because while one chapter had settled into ceremony ever could, another was already beginning, while the world celebrated not by the rules of the past, spirit, but by the palace itself began to move around her as if responding to a new gravitational force, schedules adjusted without instruction, advisors deferred instinctively, and long-standing channels of influence quietly rerouted, all signaling that something irreversible had taken hold, and at the center of it all Catherine remained unchanged in demeanor, calm, attentive, deliberate, fully aware that the greatest test of trust is not receiving it, but sustaining it without spectacle, and in the days that followed, her actions spoke with precision as she declined celebratory appearances, avoided commentary, and instead immersed herself in private briefings that spanned history, diplomacy, and public welfare, meeting with figures who had not been summoned to palace rooms in years, not as a ruler but as a listener, absorbing the fractures others ignored, because she understood what few ever had, that the crown's strength was not visibility but coherence, and coherence had been slipping for decades, and while the public saw reassurance, behind the walls the resistance hardened, particularly among those who believed authority must always flow downward, never outward, never earned through connection, and never affirmed by public will, and it was within that tension that Camilla's silence began to unsettle rather than reassure, because it became clear she was no longer reacting, she was waiting, and those closest to the structure knew that waiting often preceded maneuver, but this time the ground beneath her had shifted too far, because Catherine's influence was no longer symbolic, it was functional. Committees requested her presence, ambassadors sought her counsel, and foreign leaders referenced her steadiness in private correspondence, a signal that the world was already recalibrating, and perhaps the most telling moment came quietly when a long-delayed Commonwealth initiative stalled under internal disagreement was revived after a single meeting Catherine attended without cameras, because she did not impose direction, she aligned purpose, reminding everyone present that unity was not conformity, it was shared responsibility, a philosophy that resonated deeply with younger generations who had long felt disconnected from royal tradition, and as that resonance grew, the palace found itself responding to public confidence rather than attempting to shape it, a reversal that unsettled those accustomed to control, yet strengthened the institution in ways polling numbers could barely capture, and while whispers circulated about future roles, Catherine refused all speculation, maintaining that her focus remained service, not outcome, a stance that only amplified belief. in her sincerity, because in an age of ambition disguised as humility, true restraint stands out unmistakably, and William's support remained steady, not loud, not theatrical, but present in every shared appearance and quiet gesture, reinforcing a partnership rooted in mutual respect rather than strategy, while unobserved with a satisfaction earned through patience, knowing that legacy is not defined by who stands tallest, but by who stands firm when others waver, and even as internal documents were reviewed and long-term reforms discussed, nothing was rushed, because Catherine understood that lasting change must feel organic, not imposed, and that the monarchy's survival depended on being recognized not as distant authority but as a stabilizing presence in uncertain times, and so the transformation continued not with disruption but with recalibration, slowly, deliberately, unmistakably, until even skeptics found themselves acknowledging the shift, not because they were persuaded, but because resistance no longer made sense, and in the background a new generation watched closely, learning not from instruction but from example, witnessing how composure outlasts conflict and how influence rooted in trust endures beyond title, and as the palace settled into this new rhythm, one truth became increasingly clear: the future had not arrived with noise or force, it had arrived through consistency, clarity, and connection, and while many still debated what Catherine's role would ultimately be called, the nation had already answered in its own way, by listening, by trusting, and by moving forward with her, because sometimes the most powerful leadership is not declared, it is recognized, and this recognition had only just begun.